I want to take a moment before we go any further. I just want to recognize Kirsten on the violin today. Didn't she do a great job? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. You almost hear it and you don't even look that way because it's just so profoundly beautiful. And so just, wow. She grew up in this church. Isn't that amazing, the talent that's in this place? Hey, well, welcome again. Thanks for being here. Today's message is actually just for the men. So ladies, feel free to relax for a moment, but don't start talking amongst yourselves. You can text each other, that's fine. But this is really for the guys. But ladies, just a real word to you. I think you're going to find this pretty interesting. All right, here's the deal, men. What we're going to talk about today isn't really a religious thing or even a Christian thing. It's really a man thing, because every one of us, every man in this room and watching online, has already made a decision, and most of us are pretty confident we made the right one. But the interesting part is that most of us didn't realize we made it. So today and next week, I want to take a little time to examine that decision together and make sure we actually have gotten it right. Because this decision is important for every man, but it's especially important for those of us who are dads, right? Because whatever decision we make about this, we pass on to our sons as an example of what a man is supposed to be. And we also pass on to our daughters an expectation of the kind of men they should look for. Now, the decision I'm talking about is this: how do we define masculinity? In other words, how do we decide what it means to be a man? How do we pursue it? How do we demonstrate it? And most of us have never sat down and consciously made that decision, but every one of us has picked up a definition somewhere along the way from our dads, from culture, from friends, from movies, and even from social media. And whether we realize it or not, we're living out that definition every single day. So the question we're going to wrestle with together is this: did we get it right? Now, when we talk about masculinity, what we're really talking about is our picture of what it means to be a man. It's our expectation or standard that we hold for ourselves. It's what we're aiming for, right? It's our North Star. It's the thing that quietly guides us in how we see ourselves and how we try to live. Right, so to get us started, I want to give you a very general definition of masculinity, and it's a general definition on purpose. And I just want you to know there's a lot of wiggle room in it because we don't all picture masculinity the same way. And honestly, that's part of the reason we're having this conversation today and next week. So here's the definition. Look up here. Masculinity is a set of attributes, behaviors, and roles generally associated with men and boys. And there's a lot of wiggle room in that definition, because if we went around the room and asked every guy to make a list of those attributes, behaviors, and roles, we'd probably end up with a lot of different answers. But here's the interesting part. Even if we wouldn't all write down the exact same list, every one of us is pretty sure we know what belongs on it. Right? You already have a picture in your mind of what a real man looks like, and a sense of what men are supposed to do, and how men are supposed to act, and what men are supposed to be. And whether you realize it or not, that picture is shaping the way you live your life. And if I were to ask you, what does it mean to be a man, and what are the attributes, behaviors, and the roles of a real man, you'd probably have an answer, even if you've never actually sat down and thought about it before, because most of us assume the answer is just obvious, right? Because it feels intuitive and self-evident. Like, well, duh, Matt, of course I know what a man is supposed to be. But do we? That's the question. Because the reason I'm not so sure we actually do know this, and this is why we're talking about this whole thing, and whatever you do, don't leave early when I say this, but to some degree, someone else defined masculinity for you and me. Right? Somewhere along the way, we picked up our picture of what a man is supposed to be. Maybe it was our dad. Maybe it was our coach or culture. Maybe it was a movie, a celebrity, or the guys we grew up around. But the point is, we didn't build that definition of masculinity in a vacuum. We inherited it. And the real question we're going to wrestle with is this: is the definition we inherited actually the right one? And I'm going to tell you a little more about that in just a minute, but the reality is this. Someone other than you helped define masculinity for you. You were born into a family that showed you, intentionally or unintentionally, what a man looks like. Maybe it was modeled well, or maybe it wasn't modeled very well. Maybe it was clear, or maybe it was confusing. But either way, right, you saw something. And not only that, we're all born into a culture that constantly tells us what it means to be a man. Right? Culture has its own script. It says, this is what strength and success looks like. This is what a real man does. And whether we realize it or not, we absorb those messages from family and friends and media and the world around us. So before we ever stop to think about it, a definition was already forming inside of us. In fact, we're all born into a country that tells us this is what it means to be a man. And not just a country, right? We're born in different regions of the country that have their own ideas about manhood, right? Some of you even came from long family lines where that definition has been passed down for generations. Your great-grandfather, then your grandfather, then your father, and now it's your turn. So all these things together start giving us a script for what it means to be a man and for what masculinity looks like. These ideas are handed to us, right? But it often feels like they were more draped over our shoulders because these things come with expectations, right? This is how a man behaves. This is how a man responds. And the script was handed to you just like it was handed to me. And after a while, it starts to feel intuitive and obvious, but it's not nearly as intuitive as we might think. Because somebody handed you and me a script, and often that script carries weight and expectation. Maybe it was your father, your grandfather, an uncle, or the man who raised you. Maybe it was even your mom if you were raised by a single mom who tried to show you, son, this is what it looks like to be a man. This is what a man does and how a man behaves. But here's the thing, and this is why we're talking about it today. That script may have not fit you. It may have not matched your temperament or your personality. It may have not matched your physical build or your interests. And if it did fit you, right, then you just probably put it on and ran with it. You put that thing on your shoulders and you carried it without much conflict. Yep, that's what a man is. That's what my dad showed me. That's what my family expects. And it worked. But maybe it didn't work for your brother. Maybe he struggled to live up to that same script. Maybe he tried to be more like you or like your dad, and he did his best to carry that thing, but he always felt like it didn't quite fit or never quite measured up. And that created in him insecurity, right? There was that unspoken pressure in your house about, come on, just man up. And maybe he tried for a while. Or maybe, if we're being honest, you were that brother. Maybe your brother wore the script easily. Your dad draped the same expectation over both of you, and it worked for him, but for you, it didn't fit. And the script never quite worked. Or maybe your experience was the opposite. Maybe the definition for manhood in your life was so loose that you never really felt the pressure at all. You were just free to be yourself. But here's the part I don't want you to miss. And if you're thinking right now, guys, I know where this is going, stay with me for a minute. To a large degree, not completely, but to a large degree, and probably more than many of us want to admit, masculinity is shaped by culture and society. And honestly, ladies, the same is true for femininity. Let me explain what I mean by that. Every generation and every culture within that generation tends to redefine or tweak the definition of what it means to be a man and what masculinity looks like. And those things shift over time. I'll give you an example. Now, this is a little extreme, right? So it makes the point. And I'm going to let you guess in a moment who I'm talking about, okay? So I want you to pay attention. I'm thinking of one of history's most successful military leaders. Within the context of his culture, he was considered a military genius, and honestly, a political genius too, even though they didn't use those terms back then. This man led the largest continental empire in medieval or modern history, the largest land empire the world has ever seen. But here's the interesting part. Because of how his culture defined masculinity, because of what it meant in his world to be a powerful man and a successful leader. He believed it was his responsibility to father as many children as possible with as many women as possible. Anybody want to take a guess who I'm talking about? It's not Bill Clinton. Relax. Okay, anybody want to know what I'm talking about? You know? Who is it? Look at there. He wins nothing, but Genghis Khan is right? That's awesome. The founder, you're ready for Jeopardy, my friend. The founder of the Mongol Empire. Historians believe he had hundreds of children by hundreds of women. Some estimates say he could have had been more than 1,000. And here's what's fascinating. Listen, geneticists studying Y chromosome data discovered that nearly 8% of men living in the region of the former Mongol Empire share nearly identical Y chromosomes. When you expand that globally, that means this. Look, roughly 0.5% of the male population in the entire world may trace their lineage back to him. That's about 16 million men alive today. So, guys, if you occasionally dream that you're a fierce warrior riding across the great steppe, you might actually be related to Genghis Khan. So here's the point. At that time, in the 13th century, his behavior wasn't considered abnormal in his culture or immoral. Right? That's simply what it meant to be a powerful king and how he had demonstrated strength, dominance, and success as a ruler. Now watch. At the very same time in history, over in the Western world, the University of Paris was being founded and the Magna Carta was being signed in England. And in those cultures, that kind of behavior would have been viewed as barbaric. And honestly, by our standards today, we'd probably say the same thing. So again, here's the point. Different cultures at the same time in history can have completely different definitions of what it means to be a man. And that should make all of us, guys, watch, that should make all of us pause for a moment and ask a really important question. And here it is. If masculinity changes depending on culture, how do we know which definition is the right one? Now, hopefully, the idea of siring as many children as possible with as many women as possible doesn't strike you as masculine. At least that's what I'm praying. In fact, it probably strikes you as irresponsible. But why do we see it that way? Well, part of the reason is because someone handed you and me a script. And fortunately, the script many of us receive says that's not what it means to be a man. That's not strength or leadership or responsibility. So here's my point. Our assumptions about masculinity, and this can be hard for some of us to hear, especially with everything that's going on in our culture today, our assumptions about masculinity are not entirely intuitive. They are cultural and they are learned. And then they're reinforced over time, which means we need to be careful about who we listen to and about who we look to define for us what it means to be a man. All right, I want to ask you guys a question. Don't answer out loud. I realize you may have never even thought about this subject before. What was the script you were handed? What definition of manhood was placed on you? Was it something your father showed you? An uncle? Maybe your mom, if she was the one raising you? Was it the group of guys that you grew up around? Or the culture that shaped you? What was the script, guys, that you inherited about what it means to be a man? All right, I'm going to go first. There were many men who influenced my definition of masculinity, but there's two that come to mind often. The first one was my stepfather. He was harsh, mind made up, both controlling and out of control at the same time. He was irresponsible, abusive, and disrespectful. I knew him from 4 to 18. The three big takeaways I learned about being a man from him were this. Live for yourself. Don't show or admit weakness, because weakness equals cowardness. And the third thing, you must control others or be controlled. That was my example. The second man who influenced my definition of masculinity was my Uncle Otto. We didn't call him Uncle Otto, we called him Uncle Mousy. He was a real skinny guy, And in the war that he fought in, he could jump from foxhole to foxhole without being seen very much because he was so thin. I wish I would have inherited that too, but I didn't. He was a hard worker and a good provider. He was a gentleman who respected authority. He worked hard and was responsible. He respected women and didn't see them as an object. He was a quiet leader who led his family well. He was a committed Christ follower. And the three big takeaways I learned about being a man from him, and I spent every day with him after school: respect yourself and others, be a gentle person to serve others, and Jesus Christ must be the leader of your lives. So guys, what about you? What was the script you were handed? And if you think about it, isn't it true that it mostly came from your family and from your culture? And it just felt normal. Now, whether the script fit you or not, it still felt like, well, this must be what it means to be a man because this is what is expected of me. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody handed you a manual. It was just placed on your shoulders. So what does that script look like for you? Was it mostly about external sports grade scholarships, right? Son, you need to get a good education so you can make a lot of money, support your family. And listen, those are good things. But was that the focus? Or was it more about character and who you were becoming on the inside, like integrity, kindness, courage, and responsibility? And hopefully it was a combination of both. But either way, right, it came with an expectation. And if the script fit you, you wore it and you carried it naturally. But if the script didn't fit you, guys, you know this, you struggled. You questioned yourself, or it created insecurity. Maybe you spent years trying to prove yourself, or maybe at some point you just kind of gave up. And to use a very male, masculine analogy, right, you threw in the towel. You know the picture. The boxer in the ring, covered in sweat and blood, still fighting because, right, real men are fighters. Maybe that's you. Or come on, guys, maybe some of you, you've always disliked guys like that. Maybe something about that kind of toughness makes you uncomfortable. Or maybe if you're honest, you kind of look down on men who aren't fighters. You've looked down on men who don't fit your definition of masculinity. And the reason you see it that way is because of the script that was handed to you. And here's where it gets, guys. Listen, here's where it gets even more personal. Maybe you have a son who doesn't fit your script. Or maybe if you're honest, you're afraid you might. And then you come to church each week and you hear me say, follow Jesus. And there's a group of you that hears that and thinks, sweet, passive Jesus? I can't go there. My wife loves that stuff. But that's not for me. And honestly, I get it. In fact, this is one of the reasons a lot of men don't love church. And I understand that. So there's this group of guys at Springbrook thinking, I just can't go there. My wife can follow sweet, passive, Hallmark Jesus, but that's not me. And honestly, part of the frustration for some of you is this. Your wife wants you to be more like Jesus, which is confusing to a lot of men, ladies, because if you're being completely honest, here's what you thought before, men. When I was dating my wife, I wasn't acting much like Jesus, and it didn't seem to bother her very much. But then we got married, and suddenly the rules changed. And now you're thinking, wait a minute. I'm confused. Apparently, there's a new standard I didn't even know before. That's part of the reason some men struggle with the church, because it feels like there's an expectation now that wasn't there before. And guys, you're not anti-Jesus. You're just not sure you want to follow the version of Jesus that seems sweet and passive and soft. Some of you are thinking, Matt, listen, if I could change the script a little bit, like I'd rather be like King David. I mean, I like that guy. The Bible says when he was a young man, he killed wild animals with his bare hands. And I'm not saying I want to go that far, but at least I want to think that's what I'm capable of. And then when he was a boy, he kills a giant with a slingshot. Are you kidding me? And then he walks over, guys, you know the story, grabs the giant's own sword and cuts off his head. Yeah, man up. That's a story. And you're thinking, man, I want to be that guy. Or some of you say, you know what? I'd like to follow Revelation Jesus, because Revelation Jesus is very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John Jesus. Now, I get it. Some of you have tried reading the book of Revelation. Me too, with a candle. It's confusing. But if you read long enough, you'll find him in there, trust me. And he shows up, and he's not meek and mild, right? Have you read it? Lights on. He's covered in blood, not his own blood, the blood of his enemies. And there's a sword coming out of his mouth, and you're thinking, now we're talking. My wife never told me about that Jesus. That's somebody I could follow. And here's how the scene ends in Revelation. The enemies of Jesus are defeated. Revelation 19:21, the rest were killed with a sword coming out of the mouth of the rider on the horse. Come on, man, this is good stuff, right? And all the birds gorged themselves on their flesh. It's called the Supper of God, a battlefield covered with defeated enemies and the birds descending. It's graphic and intense. And you read that and you think, I'd watch that movie. And then you realize, wait a minute, that's actually in the Bible? And suddenly you're thinking, where has that Jesus been hiding? But let me take it one step further, and this might be pushing it a little bit. If we, and I include myself in this, if you and I, guys, would have written the crucifixion of Jesus, it would have sounded very different. I want you to picture the scene. Jesus has been crucified. Here's what Luke says, Luke 23:35. The people stood there watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said he saved others. Let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him and said, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. Now imagine, just imagine, guys, if we had written the rest of that story, maybe it would go something like this. Jesus looks toward heaven and says, Father, forgive me for what I'm about to do. And then he slowly closes his hands around the nails that hold him to the cross. He rips them free, drops down from the cross, and suddenly it's game on. And he starts swinging those nails like weapons. Roman soldiers are flying everywhere. And on that day, there is a great slaughter of the enemy of God. Now that's a king worth following, right? That's a man's man. And if we told that story like that in church, suddenly every guy in the room is leaning forward going, now you got our attention. And meanwhile, our wives are thinking, oh goodness, we should have stayed home like he wanted, right? But here's the thing. Over the years, I've discovered that many Christian men, myself included, have come to admire something very different. The Jesus who said, turn the other cheek, and the Jesus who said, love one another, and the Jesus who would stop on his way somewhere important to help someone who needed help, and the Jesus who valued women and children in a culture that didn't, and the Jesus who refused to destroy his enemies. In fact, there's even a moment, I've told about it before, in the Gospels when Jesus and his disciples are traveling through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem, and they send a couple disciples on ahead to ask if they can spend the night in this Samaritan village, but the villagers say, no way, and they reject the disciples. And two of the disciples come back to Jesus and say, Lord, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and burn the whole village up? We're men. They actually ask him that. And Jesus says, guys, no burning down villages. So this tension, and this is the tension and the dilemma. How do we reconcile all of it? As Christian men, as men who want to follow Jesus, which version are we supposed to follow? Is it the Jesus of the Gospels? Is it the Jesus of Revelation? Is it the script our fathers handed us or the culture handed us? How do we decide what it really means to be a man? And here's why, men, listen, this conversation is so important. What should we point our sons toward? What kind of men should we encourage our daughters to look for? And what does it actually mean for Christian men to man up? Because I'm telling you guys, I was just at a meeting about this. Right now, there's a movement in a lot of churches calling men to do exactly that. And I understand where it comes from. Pastors look around and they see men disengaged or passive. And they think, you know what, we got to call these men to something greater. But when I read some of their literature and listen to some of those messages, you know what it sounds to me like? The solution is to return to some ancient testosterone-fueled version of masculinity that honestly might scare some of you. So the question we have to ask is this. Is that what it means to man up? How do we know? How do we define it? Because the truth is, we're not all wired the same way. Come on, some of you guys, you're more naturally aggressive. Some of us are more passive. Some of you are wired to conquer the next challenge and accomplish the next goal. And if we're honest, sometimes there's a trail of strained relationships behind because we're so focused on progress and productivity. Others of us are deeply tuned in to the people around us. Relationships matter most. Connection matters most. So which one is right? Which one is wrong? How do we define it? What does it really mean to be a man if we're going to follow Jesus? But I'm more convinced than ever that the answer to that question is found in one place, and it's not primarily in cultural definitions or ancient warrior ideals. The answer is found in Jesus of Nazareth. Not the dramatic version and image of Jesus in the book of Revelation, but the Jesus known by men and women who walked with him, who listened to him, who worked and watched how he lived, and then carried his message into the world. And the reason we know this is because men who were there documented it. Men like Matthew, who recorded the life of Jesus. Men like John, who wrote about what he saw with his own eyes. Men like Peter, who'd been there from the very beginning. And come on, guys, Peter wasn't a soft man. He had calloused hands from hauling nets. He had sunburned skin from long days on the water. He was a fisherman who did manual labor. I mean, Peter was a man's man, and yet Peter had to learn so much about what it means to follow Jesus. And over time, somehow, Peter learned to bring those two worlds together, his strength, his personality, his manliness, and the teaching of Jesus. And eventually, Peter became the leader of that entire movement, which tells us something important. Look at this. No matter what kind of man you are, no matter how you're wired, no matter what your story has been, it's in Jesus that we find the ultimate picture of what it means to be a man. And the amazing thing is this: Jesus doesn't make all men the same. He makes all men better men. Think about this. Jesus was a descendant of David, David the giant killer. David the warrior king who returned from battle covered in the blood of his enemies. And yet Jesus wins his final battle in a completely different way. David came home from battle covered in the blood of others. Jesus emerges from his final battle covered in his own blood. Jesus, the ultimate man. And to put it in terms that some of us can relate to, he was tougher than Roman nails. He was stronger than Roman steel. Scripture even describes him as the Lion of Judah. And yet in the end, he chose a different kind of strength. And here's the significance of all of this. The Lion of Judah fearlessly and voluntarily marched into the lion's den of Jerusalem, fully aware of what was waiting for him there. But he did not go as the lion. He went as the Lamb of God. And in his final act defined what it truly means to be a man. It illustrated what it looks like for a man to live the way God created men to live. Because in his final moments, Jesus dismantled so many of our flawed and imbalanced definitions of masculinity, the cultural and the family scripts, and all the things that were handed to you and me along the way. And I'm convinced that what you and I see in these final moments is actually the way forward for all men, for the alphas and the artists, for the entrepreneurs and the engineers, for the athletes and the thinkers. We're all wired differently. But the life of Jesus shows us something different, deeper that every man can become. And this is the moment, right, that draws us in. Jesus said, if I am lifted up, talking about the crucifixion, if I'm lifted up, I'll draw all people to myself, all kinds of people, all kinds of men, because in that moment, they would see the ultimate picture, intention, and purpose of what it means to be a man created in the image of our Heavenly Father. And here's what's so remarkable. There was nothing weak or passive about our King. And yet, this is the same Jesus who would stop on his way to the most important appointment of his life to heal a blind man on the side of the road. And we come back to that moment at the cross. The people stood watching, waiting for him to die. The rulers sneered at him. And come on, honestly, what kind of men mock someone who's dying on a cross? They were the real losers. They sneered at him and said, hey, he saved others, let him save himself. Come on, if you're really the king, prove it. In other words, we know what we would do if we were in your situations. The soldiers joined in and mocked him. And honestly, guys, what we have recorded in Scripture is probably the tame version. These were hardened Roman soldiers. You can only imagine the insults they hurled at Jesus as he hung there dying. Words too crude to write down. And they kept saying, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. In other words, a real man wouldn't allow this. A real man wouldn't allow himself to be defeated in public. Real men don't lose. And if you're really a king, you'd have stopped this before it even started. You wouldn't even been arrested. You wouldn't even been taken. There would be an army standing up around you. But where's your army? You're no king. And see, here's the important part. They assumed he could not save himself. But the truth is, the ultimate man refused to save himself. Because if he had saved himself, he would have forfeited the opportunity to save you and me and to save his accusers and the world. See, by refusing to do for himself what every one of his accusers would have done for themselves, Jesus defined what it truly means to be a man. And in that moment, he won a fight that his accusers didn't even realize was happening. Because see, at the cross, at that intersection of lion and lamb, men, we see perfect masculinity on display. And every man who encounters the cross is confronted with the same battle. A battle every man wrestles with and is invited to fight every single day, regardless of temperament, personality, physical strength, or how you're wired. It's the battle we're invited to fight at home and at the office, in the hotel room when no one else is around. It's the battle every man faces, and it requires the courage of a lion and the humility of a lamb. It's the battle to say no to me so that I can say yes to the people around me. It's the battle to deny myself, to control myself so that I can give more of myself away. So men, if you're a follower of Jesus, or you're trying to be, or you're just considering what this might look like, this is the script we pass on to our sons. And honestly, listen, I'm so blessed by this. This was the script my uncle handed to me. And ultimately, that translates into something even bigger: honoring and respecting people. This is the script, men, we're called to live out and model for our daughters. Because what our daughters see in us will shape the kind of men they believe exist in the world. Paul said it this way, and this is amazing when you think about it. Paul wrote these words years after the resurrection. And remember, Paul wasn't always a gentle man. Paul was a violent man. He was absolutely determined to shut the church down. He leveraged his intelligence, his influence, his passion, everything he had to try to destroy the movement of Jesus. And then he met Jesus. And that encounter changed everything. Paul went on to impact the world, and when he later reflected on the life of Jesus, look at what he writes. It's remarkable. Philippians 2:6, that Jesus, who being in very nature God in a human body, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Meaning Jesus never leveraged his position with God for his own advantage. He never played the God card, not once. His strength was his self-control. His power was his others' first love. He had so harnessed his own strength that he was able to give himself away. And then Paul writes, verse 8, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, he restrained himself, he reined himself in for your sake and for mine, and became obedient to death, even on the cross. You see, look at this next slide. He was the lion, he was the lamb. And men, he invites every one of us to follow him, to adopt his posture, his humility, his approach to life, his script. And if we do, we won't all become the same. That's not even the goal. But we will all become, look, better men, better fathers, better husbands, better friends, because we'll become more like our Savior, the ultimate man, the perfect man. Now, if you're listening to all this, guys, and you're thinking, okay, Matt, it is so hard to argue with that, but you're going to have to be more specific. Fair enough. Be back next week. Don't miss it. There's something in probably every one of us as men that generally wants to get this right. And yet at times it feels incredibly confusing, right? Isn't it true, guys? Culture tells us we're getting it right, and then it tells us we're getting it wrong. Sometimes the church says, hey, you're getting it right, while the people closest to us that we share rings with tell us we're getting it wrong. And every day we wake up trying to figure it out and trying to get it right. So wherever, guys, you land in that struggle, we're asking God to give us just a glimpse of what it looks like to truly follow Jesus, the ultimate man, the perfect man, the one who was fierce like a lion when it was time to be strong, and humble like a lamb when it was time to surrender. Guys, what do you say? Let's ask him to teach us what it means to follow him. Listen to this song.